Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Exploring Reality, where you get to learn how to share the rational side of the Christian faith. Today, we're going to talk about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. There's many different formulations that many different philosophers have come up with, from William Lane Craig to Andrew Locke to Jacobus Erasmus. The most popular and basic form of the argument has been popularized by William Lane Craig, and it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Then the argument goes on to what we call a stage two, where we identify what that first cause is and make further arguments from there in order to show that the best explanation of that first cause is God. Today, I just want to cover a particular objection that's been made popular by atheist YouTuber and talk show host Matt Dillahunty.
What does begins to exist mean? Within our local presentation of the universe, it could be argued that nothing begins to exist, that everything within the universe is merely matter and energy transposing, taking different forms and shapes. That while at some point it's true, Matt Dillahunty did not exist, everything that makes me has existed prior to me.
So he says a lot in this short clip. First, he asks, what does it mean for something to begin to exist? So, right off the bat, it doesn't really matter too much. His question isn't an objection in this instance. And a study of meteorology, the composition of parts and wholes, there's tons of views on how this works, what it actually means to begin to exist. And the majority of these are compatible with this causal principle or the first premise. So again, it doesn't really matter too much what we mean by begins to exist. For sake of simplicity, I'll put what I mean by begins to exist. For any entity E and time t, E begins to exist at t if and only if E exists at t. T is the first time at which E exists. There is no state of affairs in the actual world in which E exists timelessly, and E's existing at t is a tensed fact. So as we can see, this question he poses as an objection isn't really an objection at all. The next thing, though, has become very popular on the internet spheres that I've seen lately, so I really want to take some time to cover this. Matt brings up an objection to the causal principle via meteorological nihilism. Now, if you think back to that first word, meteorology, all that is the study of the relationship between parts and wholes. So, for instance, this ball of Play Doh has parts of smaller little parts of Play Doh. I know that's not a perfect example, but just bear with me here. Or another example would be I have parts. I have an arm, you have legs, you get the point. So when Matt in this video says it's true, Matt Dillahunty didn't always exist, but the parts that make him always did. This is what internet skeptics like him are referring to with or without knowing it. So the first thing I want to say to this is that this is still compatible with the causal principle. All we really need to do is rearrange how we're stating our causal principle. Since the causal principle says that whatever begins to exist will have causal antecedents, this can both be from previous states of affairs or an ex nihilo scenario. Either way, they both satisfy what it means to begin to exist. So, in terms of meteorological nihilism, a chair begins to exist in relation to simples caused to be arranged chairwise. So, we can still appeal to the relationship of earlier than and later than entities and simples to arrange themselves chairwise. Now, someone like Matt may be tempted to say this is a dishonest move, but this is how good philosophy is done. It isn't ad hoc to change up the causal principle to show that it can work with different metaphysical commitments. In fact, it's a good thing to do that. What we're actually doing here is not changing things up in order to fit in special plead or make ad hoc rationalizations to our principle. What we're actually doing here is showing that the core point of the principle is versatile and can fit different metaphysical commitments than what I might be committed to. In other words, this causal principle still works given other people's indirectly related metaphysical commitments, or in this case, meteorological commitments. But there's still more to say about this. For I think meteorological nihilism is false. Matt himself and many other people who will use this objection will happily admit that they exist, but didn't always exist. So, what does it mean for me to not always exist, but the simples that make me up may have always existed? What am I referring to when I say me? My consciousness. But my consciousness wasn't always there. So, it's plain to see that consciousness in this instance is an emergent property. All that is to say is that consciousness, in this case, emerges from these states. This will serve as background information for my arguments that I'm going to be putting up contra Matt Dillahunty. So here is the argument against meteorological nihilism. If emergent properties exist, then wholes are distinct from their parts. 2. Emergent properties exist, therefore, wholes are distinct from their parts. So, very clearly, emergent properties do not exist when the wholes do not exist. For instance, the whole of my human body didn't always exist, but same with my consciousness. But then, once my consciousness emerged, that only was from the state of the whole of my body. So, the question we're asking here is, do the wholes actually exist and are they distinct from the parts? The answer seems clearly to be yes, because we have emergent properties coming into existence when the wholes come into being. All this really means is if two things are going to be identical, they have to be the same. For instance, say I had two balls and I wanted to say they're identical. In this instance, they're nearly identical in almost all ways except for one. One is red, one is green. So I cannot logically say that they're identical because they have at least one different property that I can apprehend in this moment. If that's the case, then they can't actually be identical. In the same way, mereological simples or the fundamental matter that makes us up is not identical to the wholes because we have emergent properties. And support for two, pretty simple. You are an emergent property, your consciousness is. But also think about water. Depending on the temperature of the water, the pressure on the water, et cetera, we can be in a solid, liquid, or gaseous state. And so meteorological nihilism here is defeated. But wait, there's more. Let's just say somebody like Matt will hit us with that typical line, I'm not convinced. I want to really focus on a heavy price tag that somebody like Matt will have to pay in order to maintain this view. Or, in other words, I want to show Matt that if he just wants to play the skeptic here and commit himself to meteorological nihilism, there is a heavy price tag he has to pay in order to stay rational. You see, again, Matt himself admits that he didn't always exist. And again, what he means by that is his consciousness, his identity, his personhood. So, if Matt is an emergent property, which I think it's fairly clear that he is, he's stuck with a huge trilemma. If you're having trouble following, I'll break it down. If Matt wants to commit himself to meteorological nihilism, this theory commits you to something else called eliminativism. This, in philosophy of mind, is the view that the mind doesn't actually exist. You don't actually exist. The consciousness doesn't actually exist. In short, I think that this is a self defeating view because beliefs can only come from minds. But if minds don't exist, how are you holding the belief that minds don't exist? So here's the thing Matt either has to commit himself to saying he doesn't exist, or he's going to have to commit himself to always existing. The issue here is Matt is an atheist. And so, him and any other internet skeptic here is going to have to commit themselves to having some sort of immaterial consciousness to say that they always existed. In other words, they'll have to concede to having a soul. And I think most atheists like him don't want to concede that. Or he has the third option, to admit defeat on this objection and show and admit that meteorological nihilism doesn't work as an objection to this argument. So here it is in a syllogism. If emergent properties exist, then meteorological nihilism is false. Matt Dillahunty exists as an emergent property. Meteorological nihilism is false. So here is the internet skeptic's options. Either admit they always existed as an immaterial soul, admit they don't exist, or admit that meteorological nihilism is false. And so, with all this in mind, you can rest easy knowing that this objection to the causal principle of the Kalam Cosmological Argument does not work as a rebutting defeater to the causal principle. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Every single bit helps.